welcome to another episode of the MMA Lockcast. I'm your host, Manpreet, aka MMA Lock of the Night, and your boy on social media at MMALOTN. This week we're covering UFC 317, which is the International Fight Week pay-per-view card, which is normally stacked with some big names and title fights, and I believe the UFC has done a decent enough job in terms of putting together what they can to make the name of International Fight Week live up to its name. In the main event, we got the vacant lightweight title on the line as former champion Islam Makhachev has moved up to welterweight and will fight Jack Della Maddalena in the coming months. Thus, the former featherweight champion Ilia Topuria, who vacated his title earlier this year as Alexander Volkanovski wanted a few months back as he faced Diego Lopez. Ilia Topuria is moving up to 155 pounds and he takes on former champion Charles Do Bronx Oliveira in a very fun fight, very entertaining matchup. Odds indicate that this will likely be lopsided, but we know Charles Oliveira will always be a tough out for anybody standing across the cage from him. I know that was a mouthful in terms of teeing up the main event, but that's pretty much what it's been like for the featherweights, lightweights, and welterweights, specifically due to Islam Makhachev's uncertainty in terms of wanting to stay at 155 or move up to 170. But we finally got clarity after Bilal Muhammad came up short against Jack Della Maddalena, allowing Makhachev to go up to 170 pounds and become a two-weight world champion. May not be consecutively, or I should say simultaneously, but at least he gets to mark that off his list and doesn't have to kill himself to make 155 pounds anymore. And the co-main event is another title fight as we go with the flyweights and Alexandre Pantoja looking to defend his flyweight title for a fourth time as he takes on the oncoming Kai Kara France, who may not have a winning streak behind his name, but is still a solid threat to the champion, hoping to knock him out and bring a world title back to the New Zealand region. I always want to see Australia with those guys, but I'm pretty sure he's a city kickboxing guy, trains down there at New Zealand, and I'm sure they would be more than happy to have another champion down there. There's a lot of other fun fights on the card, not to mention Peyton Talbott looking to bounce back into the win column as he takes on streaking prospect Philippe Lima, and Beneil Dariush going up against Renato Moicano. That should be a fun, entertaining matchup as well, and a lot of other fun fights sprinkled out throughout the card. Now, before I get into the breakdowns, I do want to quickly go through the Lock of the Night and Dog of the Night plays for this past UFC Baku card. And it came through for us with our Lock of the Night play with Rafael Fiziev, who I'd chipped in at plus 105 as my Lock of the Night play. And he ended up closing closer to plus 125, which I just do not understand how the line got as wide as it did. And it seemed like Fiziev was in control the entire time and made it a sweat-free underdog Lock of the Night play cash for us. Now, he went 2-0 on the weekend for Lock of the Night plays as Justin Wetzel came through for us for PFL as well. And now that continues to bring us in the right direction for the Lock of the Night plays this year. Now 27-23 on the year for a 54% hit rate. Moving in the right direction, digging ourselves out of the hole, and I'm very happy about that. Dog of the Night plays, starting to slump there a little bit. We went 0-3 this past weekend with the Dog of the Night play for the UFC being Jamal Hill. Had absolutely no answers for the Muay Thai approach of Khalil Roundtree, who was able to batter that lead leg of Jamal Hill, forcing him to fight out of his secondary stance, and he was just not as effective there. Ended up getting dropped a few times as well, but ultimately Roundtree wins that fight on the scorecards, and Hill seems more washed than he had been going into that matchup, and it was a very poor performance. So, obviously, we'll have a Lock of the Night play for this weekend's UFC 317 card, which I've already locked in and dropped on the Lock of the Night Patreon page. You'll also be able to find early breakdowns for the PFL card that's going to be going down this week, not to mention both Cage Warriors cards and the OKTAGON card as well. All of those will be in written form on the Lock of the Night Patreon page, as well as all the tracked plays, all the DGen parlays, all the props. Make sure you guys check it out. The Lock of the Night Patreon page is in the description below. All right, we got, I believe, 12 or 13 fights scheduled for this UFC 317 card. So without further ado, let's get right into this bad boy. The first matchup up is going to be in the welterweight division, as we have Nico Price coming in at a whopping plus 1,000, going up against Jacoby Smith, who comes in at minus 2,000. Now, starting off on the Nico Price side of things, he came up short against Themba Gorimbo in his last matchup, and I actually chipped in on Nico Price there at plus 250. I thought it was a solid spot to jump in on him on, especially with the previous performance that he had against Alex Morono. He had a slow start against Morono, but picked it up in the second and third rounds with good takedown defense, good reversals, and good striking, power striking, something that we've come to know from him. But he had no answer for Gorimbo, who was able to lull Price into a striking battle for the first minute or two of each round before he eventually changed levels, dragged Price to the ground, and managed to keep him there. I was really hoping that we'd see a little bit more resistance from Price that night, but he ended up getting swept on the scorecards and showcasing that he still has a lot of holes in his game that superior fighters are going to be able to take advantage of. And that's what he's going up against here, is a superior fighter in Jacoby Smith. Maybe not so much in terms of experience, as Nico Price has over 2.5 times the experience of Jacoby Smith, but Smith is undefeated at 10-0, 29 years old, has massive knockout power, which he showcased last time around in his short notice UFC debut, where he knocked out Preston Parsons back in January. Now, that was a very weird circumstance for Smith, who had already secured his UFC contract through the Contender Series back in October with a second round ground and pound victory over Christian Savoy. But he still took a short notice matchup, which is not something you see from somebody that's already secured a UFC contract. But Smith was more than confident to go in there against Parsons and showcase he was a superior fighter. They had some exchanges in the pocket to start off that matchup, but it ultimately only took him 73 seconds to find that big shot to drop Preston Parsons and earn that knockout victory in his UFC debut. Now, how he matches up against Nico Price is very favorable. Maybe not minus 2,000. I don't think anything in MMA should be considered minus 2,000, considering the volatility of the sport. But Smith, I think, is a much harder power puncher. I think he also has the advantage in terms of dragging this fight to the ground and smothering Price from that top position if he needs to. And I think that's the approach he'll likely be looking to take here, especially against an athletic and explosive Nico Price. Look for Smith to put his punches together, to eventually mask some takedown attempts behind it. And he has a high-level collegiate wrestling background that he can lean on. And I think with the help of his head coach, Saif Sayoud, they can game plan a solid enough spot here to take Nico Price to the ground over and over again, smother him, maybe finish him in deep water. But I think that Smith ends up winning this fight on the scorecards. But at minus 2,000, you can't be parlaying that type of number. All right, next up in the heavyweight division, we got Jonathan Diniz coming in at minus 280, going up against Alvin Hines, who comes in at plus 240. Starting off on the Diniz side of things, he had his winning streak snapped last time around by Marcin Tybura. I believe that fight was back at UFC 309 in November, and that's where Diniz had no answer for the wrestling of Tybura, who absolutely brutalized him from that top position through the first 10 minutes of that matchup, forcing the doctor to step in before the third round, and that's where we saw Diniz have to pick up a KO loss due to a doctor stoppage. On the feet, we know he is very dangerous with his kickboxing approach, managing his distance, and making opponents pay for any of their mistakes. And he's also a guy that, even though he has a ton of knockouts on his record, does not chase the knockout. He more so allows the fight to just play out, lets his combinations go, and if a knockout or a knockdown shows itself, then he starts to go for the finish and tries to get his opponents out of there. Has decent cardio for a guy that's built the way that he is. His takedown defense is slowly improving, but it's really been his lack of get-ups that has caused him trouble in the first round against Austin Lane, and then obviously in the 2 rounds that he had against Marcin Tybura. He's going up against a guy in Alvin Guzzi Hines, who's built a bit of a cult following on the LFA regional scene. Whenever they would step foot in Minnesota, and he'd have the loudest ovation and all the love and admiration of the crowd just because of how much of a working man he seems like. I believe he's an engineer during the day, but he's very strong, very physical, and has a decent BJJ game, which he's been able to show off throughout his career. Last time around, he fought in April, where he went to war against Billy Ray Valdez and showcased some solid, improved striking. Really wanted to get that head kick knockout, which came to fruition at the beginning of the third round. But we did see some takedown attempts from him that did not come to fruition. But that normally pays off for him in his previous fights, where he quickly takes opponents to the ground and then smashes them from that top position, either with ground and pound, or he opens up submission opportunities where he's been able to force the tap against some guys. I thought he was up against it in terms of his age and getting to the UFC, but luckily that win against Billy Ray Valdez and I believe it was Junior Tafa or Justin Tafa that pulled out of this matchup against Diniz, that opened the opportunity for Guzzi to get his UFC spot, and here he is looking to pull off the upset against a superior striker. Now Hines has, mediocre striking. The guy likes to stalk his opponents, keeps his hands up high, and then wings forward with some big shots, but I think he is most successful when he can take opponents to the ground and really establish that top position where he's been able to often find finishes. I believe he has 3 wins by submission, 3 wins by knockout, and then 1 win by decision. And I think in this matchup against Diniz, he's really going to have to lean on that grappling if he hopes to get his hand raised. I think Diniz might be a little bit too big and too strong for Hines, unfortunately. I think we'll see Diniz keep Hines at distance, shuck off a few of the first takedowns. I don't think Hines has good of a takedown game as Marcin Tybura. I think he's a little bit more, looking to muscle guys to the ground. If he does get the takedown, he should be able to hold Diniz down and maybe even work to a finish, which is why my confidence on the Diniz side is not all that high. I think he wins. I think he picks Hines apart and eventually finds that knockout, but at minus 280, and knowing that Hines, if he is able to establish that top position, knowing all that, it doesn't give you too much confidence in somebody closing in on that 75% indicated range when he's so bad off of his back and Hines has shown an ability to smash people from that top position. You don't want to tie yourself up with that. So if the line starts to widen and Hines closes in closer to plus 300, plus 350, maybe I'd be forced to take a little bit of a sprinkle on him there. But I think I'll stick with my prediction of Diniz eventually finding the knockout and getting that win within 2 rounds. All right, another short notice UFC debutant hailing from Minnesota as well. We got Rodrigues Dumas in this middleweight division coming at evens at minus 110 as he takes on the newcomer Jackson McVey, who just picked up a victory 2 weeks prior to this matchup, also coming in at minus 110. We'll start off on the Dumas side of things, though, as he comes in off of a loss against Michal Oleksiejczuk in a matchup where he got dropped and then ground and pounded until the referee was forced to step in and stop that fight. He is now 1-2 over his last 3 fights, with both of those losses coming by first-round stoppage, first-round knockout specifically. That loss against Sultan Raziboev from last year is a little bit of an asterisk, right? That was a matchup where Raziboev had poked Dumas in the eye, and Dumas was trying to get the attention of the referee and unfortunately did not, and ended up getting finished shortly thereafter. And then he bounced back with a grueling, grinding victory over Denis Tiuliulin, where he was able to pin him up the cage for the first 2 rounds, slow down in that 3rd round, but held on long enough to see the scorecards to get his hand raised. He's also been entrenched in a ton of legal issues, from getting arrested, abduction, kidnapping, I think was some of the things that he's been getting locked up for, or at least charged for. Not a good look, and surprised that the UFC is still giving some opportunities to him for that. I think something was as recent as April. So to come in on short notice here, this could be one of those spots where the UFC's either win or go home. And if he ends up losing, they probably just bail on him and eventually just cut him and have nothing to do with him at that point. he showcased some decent long distance striking, some good kicks from distance. He's also had a nasty front choke, which he showed on the Contender series, where he finished Matic Peñas, who's been doing great things over there in Octagon. And that's a matchup where I feel if there was a rematch, I think Peñas would absolutely obliterate Dumas at this time. So I think that was kind of lightning in the bottle type of moment for Dumas to get that win over Peñas. I'm not sold on him. I tried giving him the benefit of the doubt against Oleg Shayjuk. He just does not seem to enjoy getting hit. And not saying anybody enjoys getting hit, but, his reaction time just did not look that good, nor did his reactions, period. Now, he's going up against Jackson McVey, who's 6-0, finished all of his opponents in the first round. A guy that has only ever seen the second minute of a pro fight once, while 4 of his 6 fights have finished in less than a minute. He's just going out there and squishing these guys. He has no issue pushing the pace against them, looking to take them to the ground, snatch up their neck, and try to get them out of there sooner than later. In his last matchup, which I mentioned earlier, was just 2 weeks ago, he was able to just walk his opponent down and eventually land a nasty knee that crumpled his opponent, and some quick ground and pound shots after that ended the fight. McVey is big, 6'4", 77-inch reach, formerly from Minnesota, has now set up shop down there in Kansas. Looks to be a fun fighter, but he's still only 26 years old and has been rolling over tomato cans up until this UFC debut of his. Not saying Dumas is this crazy good fighter, but at least he'll provide a little bit more resistance than what we've seen McVey have to go up against recently. And that's where my pause starts to come in terms of trusting him to get the victory here. I'm still going to pick McVey to win this matchup. I think he finds that finish in the first 2 rounds. And even at this even money line, unless McVey somehow becomes a dog of some sort, plus 130, plus 150 range, I'd rather pass on this, right? I want to give credence to Dumas' strength of schedule, his experience, the fact that he's actually faced guys that will provide legit resistance towards him, the fact that he has wins over guys like Cody Brundage and Abu Azaitar. Much better than anything Jackson McVey has done in his career thus far. Now, this might be one of those moments where McVey, rises to the level of his opposition or rises to the occasion and has a tremendous UFC debut, but tough to be overly confident here on the McVey side. I will pick him to win. Maybe round 1, round 2 prop is something I'll try to sneak in on here, but otherwise I'm fine with passing. I'll pick McVey to win this matchup and finish Dumas within 2 rounds. All right, next up in the lightweight division, we got Terrence McKinney coming in at minus 170, taking on Vyacheslav Borshchev, who comes in at plus 145. Now, starting off on the McKinney side of things, this guy continues to go out there and just squash tomato cans, right? Like Damir Hadzovic, not a bad fighter, but horrible on the ground. And that's where McKinney was looking to take this fight as soon as he could. He did land some big shots of his own to bloody the nose of Hadzovic, but eventually he got him to the ground. And from there, he was just playing with him until he eventually got that TKO finish by taking the back and flattening Hadzovic out. But when we see McKinney fight anybody that will provide a little bit of resistance, that's where we see him end up coming up short. Like in his last 5 fights, he's 3-2, but those 2 losses are losses to Nazim Sadikov and Esteban Ribovics. His wins are over Mike Breeden, Brendan Marat, and Damir Hadzovic. 2 of those guys, which I don't even believe are with the UFC anymore. He's, in my opinion, a top 10 lightweight for the first 2 to 3 minutes of his fights, but he makes a lot of mistakes from the technical side of things because he can make up for it with his athleticism, explosiveness, and finishing abilities. He has some big power in his hands, has some nasty head kicks as well, but I think he is most dangerous where he can play it safest, and that's what's looking to take opponents to the ground, where he quickly transitions to dominant positions. And even in the fights that he's lost, well, the Sadikov fight, he had Sadikov's back for a while before he ended up gassing himself out and allowing Sadikov to find the finish early in that second round. And that's where the concern comes from McKinney. If he can't get the finish within 3 minutes, 4 minutes tops, he more than likely has used too much energy to the point that he gasses himself out and leaves himself ripe for the picking for his opponents. And unfortunately for him, he's fighting a very tough and very durable Vyacheslav Borshchev here. Now, Borshchev coming off a loss against a very tough Tom Nolan last time around. very close matchup, but I thought Nolan did enough to at least squeeze out the first 2 rounds. We saw Borshchev really start to pick up steam in that 3rd round, but by then it was just too little too late. Primarily a kickboxer, but we've seen him improve the rest of his game very well. He's 33 years old, has 14 fights of experience under his belt now, but even when fights end up getting into the grappling realm, we see great submission defense from him, and we see an ability to just stay safe even if he finds himself hurt. I constantly look back at the Nazim Sadiqov fight and the Chase Hooper fights where he constantly found himself defending submissions. But even though he lost to Hooper by submission, that one had a little bit of controversy behind it, right? I think he didn't tap. I think the referee thought he went out, but they didn't even try to, dispute it at all. They just took it on the chin. But that was the only fight where he got finished. And that just goes to show his durability, his submission defense, his improvements as an overall mixed martial artist. And then to go out there and just smash guys on the feet with his pace, combinations, and pressure. He's such a fun fighter to watch, and I think that's why we'll often see him hold that UFC spot because of the style that he brings to the table. And the fact that, I think in 3 of his, 8 fights in the UFC, he's gotten either a performance bonus or a fight of the night bonus. There are some fights that didn't win it, but could have won it, depending on if there are other fights going down on that card. Now, getting back to this fight against McKinney, if you guys have been following me long enough, the one spot that I love to target in McKinney fights is the under 1.5. Now, let me just throw these numbers out at you guys once again. In 19 of his 23 pro fights, they've all finished in round 1. 22 of his 23 pro fights have finished under 1.5 rounds. That includes all 10 of his UFC fights, 2 of which have squeaked into the 2nd round, but he ended up getting finished there. And that just goes to show, the issues that he has. He's a berserker from jump and pretty good at finding the finish early enough, which is why he has a 16-7 record to begin with. But then once that gas tank fails him, things go out the window pretty quickly. And that's where I think Borshchev can really take advantage of him. Sure, McKinney might get him to the ground immediately and get those dominant positions. And if he can get that quick TKO stoppage, I think he would be better suited to try to TKO Borshchev than to catch him in a submission, because Borshchev has shown great submission defense. If he can't get it done within the first 2 to 3 rounds, 2 to 3 minutes, I think we'll see Borshchev defend well enough, scramble well enough, and that will quickly deplete the gas tank of McKinney, leading to Borshchev putting on the pressure and eventually finding that finish either in the first or early 2nd round. I think the under 1.5 in this matchup should be money, just like it always is in McKinney fights. And even though Borshchev is not, just as volatile in terms of McKinney with his finishes, I think McKinney just brings that out of his opponents, and he'll bring that out of Borshchev in this spot. So either McKinney gets that early finish. I like Borshchev to pull off the upset, considering the defense that I've been speaking about recently, but I think that he'll be able to stop most of McKinney's threats early, maybe even catch him when McKinney looks to be a little bit too reckless with his striking. And I think from there we'll see Borshchev land that big shot to either counter McKinney and put him away, defend some of the grappling early, and then get this back to the feet where he can start walking McKinney down and finish him, or just catch him quickly and get him out of there as well. Under 1.5 is my favorite spot in this matchup, but I'm going to pick Borshchev as the underdog to pull off the upset and get the finish in round 1. All right, next up, we got women's flyweights throwing down here as we have Viviane Araujo coming in at plus 215, going up against Tracy Cortez, who comes in at minus 255. Now, start off on the Araujo side of things, who pulled off a solid upset last time around, I believe, close to a plus 240 underdog against Karine Silva, who had been streaking up until that point. But Araujo had a soft first round, but in the 2nd and 3rd rounds, something that we haven't really seen from her in the past, she picked it up. She showcased good takedown defense. She was even landing takedowns of her own, reversals of her own, had some good submission attempts. But ultimately, it was the damage she was able to inflict on Karine Silva that earned her the decision victory once the fight hit the scorecards. Normally, she showcases slick striking, some decent grappling, but that often starts to fall off after that first round. But I think the matchup that she had against Silva was more than good enough for her to thwart that grappling onslaught and then start to come on as Silva start to slow down herself. Araujo is now 38 years old. She'll be 39 not too late from now, if I'm not mistaken. I believe she'll be turning 39 within the next coming months. But either way, 38, not the type of age you want to be when you're fighting mixed martial arts, especially when you're going up against a younger, hungrier contender, just as she is this weekend against Tracy Cortez. Now, Cortez had her winning streak snapped last time around by Rose Namajunas, which was a short notice main event slot for Tracy. That fight took place back in July, where Cortez, I believe, had another fight on the books. I think it was against Miranda Maverick, but after Rose Namajunas lost her opponent, Cortez stepped in and unfortunately learned a lesson that there are levels to this game. Cortez normally relies heavily on a wrestle-heavy approach, taking opponents down and smashing them from that top position or just grinding them out and winning fights on the scorecards while showing a good cardio game as well. But against Namajunas, she couldn't get to her takedowns. She was 2 of 5 on takedown attempts. She could only get about 58 seconds of control time, whereas Namajunas was able to land 5 of 5 takedown attempts and accrued close to 6.5 minutes of control time. Now, I don't know if it was the altitude or the game that Namajunas was throwing at her with her striking advantage, but Cortez not as aggressive with her takedowns that night as most would have expected her to be. But she is a fighter, and I think that was a good learning lesson for her. And to come back in this matchup against Araujo, I think we'll see a much better version of her and probably even more of a dominant version of her. Look for this to be somewhat competitive early, as Araujo will have a striking advantage, but she is not much of a finisher, so I don't think Cortez has much to worry about in that aspect. Look for Cortez to mix her takedowns well behind her striking, and then as Araujo starts to slow down later on in this matchup, I think we'll see Cortez pick up steam in the second and third rounds, which may lead to a late Cortez stoppage here. But considering that the majority of these the fights between these women have gone to the scorecards, and the over 2.5 is sitting at minus 600, I think there's a reason why that is, and it's because neither of these women are all that threatening in terms of submissions or knockouts. But I'll go Cortez, and Cortez by decision, and at minus 255, I think she's more than worthy of being a parlay piece as well. All right. Moving over to the featherweight division now. We got a very hot matchup here between two rising prospects. We got Haider Amil coming in at plus 145, going up against Jose Delgado, who comes in at minus 170. Now, starting off on the Amil side of things, he is coming off a solid upset victory over William Gomez from earlier this year, where he started off a little slow, but really started to pick it up in the second and third rounds with his constant forward pressure, his takedown attempts, and his clinch, and some big shots to close that distance, which caused Gomez a ton of trouble. Now, Gomez was the superior technical striker, but he was unable to get off on it with that constant pressure that he was dealing with. Now, that's back-to-back matchups now where Amil has pulled off the upset as a decent-sized underdog. Even in his previous matchup against Jung Young Lee, who was a little bit too engaging in the pocket exchange from jump, and he ended up paying for it as Amil's durability showed up, and Amil eventually landed that big shot to put Lee away. And that's what Amil has relied on a lot, because a lot of his fights see him engaging in the pocket more than he should, but his durability is held up. His recoverability in some fights where he's been rocked a little bit has held up, and that's allowed him to get back to his grappling and his pressure, which often breaks his opponents down and allows him to pull away in deeper water. I love everything about his game other than the fact that he started mixed martial arts a little bit too late. I believe he had his first pro fight when he was 33 years old, and now he finds himself at 35. And, it's very good that he's been able to get to the UFC after, 2.5 years, or I guess less than 2 years of being a pro. But I think a lot of that also had to do with the mentoring that he was getting from the former Strikeforce lightweight champion, Gilbert Melendez, who was often in his corner. Now he's going up against another guy that's been mentored by a former champion, Benson Henderson. We got Jose Delgado, who's looking to build upon his UFC debut where he knocked out Conor Matthews in the first round of their matchup. Now, Delgado is a very slick striker with good timing and good range management. And in that matchup against Matthews, he had to work out of some bad grappling spots, but he quickly got back to his feet and made Conor Matthews pay for the technical striking advantage that Delgado was holding in that matchup. But in the past, we've seen Delgado get grinded out by strong, or I should say a strong wrestler, and Chris Makate, who's currently a standout LFA prospect who's been putting together a solid run of his own. But Delgado has been working on his takedown defense, working on his grappling defense, so he can keep fights in the striking realm where he will often have an advantage over his opponent. And obviously training over there at the MMA lab, getting a lot of the focus of Benson Henderson, believing in this 27-year-old that he could take it to the next level and actually become a contender and maybe even a champion, is obviously buoying the confidence of Delgado, and which is why I thought he looked so good against Connor Matthews. But this is a tough one, right? You got streaking prospects, two guys that are, inching closer into contendership. Delgado probably having a higher upside because of him being 27 years old. But you have to wonder, will the pace, the pressure, the grind of Haider Amil catch up to Delgado in this spot? As an underdog, I tend to lean that way. Now, going into researching this matchup, I really expected to lean on the Delgado side and even take a shot on him at minus 170. I felt he'd showcase good enough takedown defense and superior striking, which would eventually lead to him landing a big shot on Amil and putting him away. But like I said, Amil's durability has held up very well. His grappling and wrestling could end up thwarting that pressure and that striking advantage of Delgado. And I think that will allow Amil to kind of replicate what he did against William Gomez. Gomez, a little bit more fast twitch than Delgado, maybe a little bit more pop on his shots too. And we saw Amil ate some big shots there and still managed to wade through the fire and get to his game. He should be able to do that here against Delgado as well. So going from leaning Delgado to now on the Amil side, I have to take that shot at plus 145, as I think he can apply that pressure and be safe enough with it to keep Delgado on the defensive, allowing Amil to win this fight on the scorecards. All right, moving over to the, I believe, prelim headliner now, where we got a middleweight matchup between Jack Hermansson, who comes in at plus 170, taking on Gregory Rodrigues, who comes in at minus 195. Now, starting off on the Hermansson side of things, he's been alternating wins and losses over his last 5 fights, but 2 of those were wins over prospects that a lot of people were high on, the first of which against Edmund Shabazian, and then last time around in February of 2024 in a main event matchup against the streaking Joe Pyfer. We saw Hermansson utilize a ton of range, a lot of kicks from distance, engaging in the clinch and pushing Pyfer against the cage. And even though Hermansson dropped the first 2 rounds of that fight, he rallied back in the last 3 rounds and ended up winning that fight on the scorecards. Unfortunately for him, he's been riddled with injuries and surgeries and recovery ever since that matchup, which is why he's been unable to follow up on that win. And he's been out of competition now, I believe, for about 16 months, dealing with his shoulder surgery, recovery from that, and then little knick-knack injuries as well that he's been trying to bounce back from. Obviously, he even talked about it. The body is not as healthy or as not breakable. It's a little bit more fragile now at 37 years old. He's also coming closer to his 38th birthday as well, if I'm not mistaken. And I think that's causing his body to just break down a little bit more than it has. And this is a guy with 32 professional fights, fighting some of the higher level guys in the middleweight division throughout his career. So, at his best, he can either distance strike and pick opponents apart in a boring point fighting style. He's also showcased some good grappling with his Greco-Roman style, where he's been able to take opponents to the ground and have some good success from that top position, or even grind them out over 15 minutes if he needs to. Now he's going up against a very tough Gregory Rodrigues, who's looking to bounce back after having his 3-fight winning streak snapped at the hands of Jared Cannonier from earlier this year. Gregory Rodrigues was really rolling, with finishes over Dennis Tuliulian and Brad Tavares, who was kind of hard to put away leading into that matchup. And then a very dominant victory over Christian Leroy Duncan. A lot of people thought it was finally time for Rodrigues to break into title contention. Unfortunately, after a decent start against Jared Cannonier in their main event slot, we saw Rodrigues really started to slow down in the second and third rounds, and that's where Cannonier really started to pick up the pace and eventually wear Rodrigues down, hurting him very badly at the ending of the third round and then quickly finishing him at the beginning of the fourth round. Rodrigues still has some work to do in terms of managing his gas tank and knowing the proper way to mix his striking behind his grappling, especially with how much we know that he is a high-level BJJ black belt. The issue is, He hasn't won by submission in nearly 7 years. So maybe mixing in the grappling a little bit more would benefit him, as at least in terms of managing his gas tank better, being able to just, get a couple extra breaths in when he gets his opponent to the ground, but also not putting everything into all of his strikes, which often will have him slowing down. But we can't take away what Jared Cannonier was successful in doing with that fight, right? He got hurt early, but he managed to bounce back in the following rounds where he really started to put the pressure on Rodrigues and utilize his speed and his explosivity to land those big shots to break Rodrigues down. But whenever Rodrigues has suffered defeat in the octagon, he is successful in terms of bouncing back and even going on a bit of a winning streak after those fights. And I expect him to keep that trend going this weekend when he takes on the veteran Jack Hermansson, any matchup that I think is very favorable for Rodrigues. I think even if Hermansson tries to utilize that kicking approach from distance and keep Rodrigues at bay, I think we'll see Rodrigues cut off the cage well, engage in the clinch enough, and really start wearing Hermansson down. I think also we'll see Rodrigues land some big shots of his own, and I think he will end up relying on some of those takedowns to keep Hermansson still and muzzle the offense coming back from the Norwegian fighter. I believe he's Norwegian. I want to say Denmark or Norway, but I want to say Norway. Let's go Norway. But either way, I like Rodrigues to bounce back in this matchup. I think this minus 195 line is somewhat generous. I think maybe by fight time he finds himself at minus 250, minus 300. And I think he wins this matchup by grinding it out. Before we get on over to the main card, I quickly want to plug the MMA Fight Archive with over 20 different promotions covered on the service, but also close to or over 5,400 fighter profiles. You have as many direct links as you could possibly need to know what to expect from these fighters before they step foot on the cage on the weekends. We cover so many different promotions, and we got close to 120 subscribers on the service as well, which stems from handicappers and analysts, commentators, coaches, fighters. You guys can check it out for free as well with a 7-day free trial. If you do your own researching or studying, I promise this will save you a boatload of time for you to browse through and get as many direct links as possible. Once again, 7-day free trial, the MMA Fight Archive. Check the link in the description below. All right. Let's get right into the main card, which starts with a bantamweight banger between Peyton Talbott, who comes in at plus 170, and streaking contender, or rising contender, I should say, Philippe Lima, who comes in at minus 200. Now, I think Peyton Talbott's last fight is a perfect example of how fickle and quick to turn the MMA fan base is. Going into his matchup against Raoni Barcelos, everybody and their mother was more than happy to parlay him at that crazy minus 1,000 number that he was having thinking that he can just go out there and quickly starch Barcelos. I'm a tad bit guilty of that, right? I didn't parlay him, but I did look for that round 1 KO prop, which I believe we got a decent plus 100-ish line on. But he had no answer for the wrestling of Barcelos, who continuously took him to the ground and kept him on his back and showcased some of the issues that may still be remaining in the 26-year-old's game. Prior to that, he had showed great takedown defense on the regional scene, and from there his striking flowed so effortlessly, which made him such a commodity and why he became a fan favorite and why everybody was all over him when he went into that Raoni Barcelos fight back in January. But credit to him for taking a stiff competition or stiff opponent now this weekend in Philippe Lima and not taking any layups to try to get his confidence back and try to get back into the win column. He's going up against Philippe Lima here, who is a former Octagon champion, and he was actually scheduled to defend his title before the UFC came calling. And credit to Octagon for giving Philippe Lima his release, because after that he was able to go on and pick up the biggest win of his MMA career as he submitted Mohamed Naimov in the 3rd round of their matchup. He followed that up by sweeping Miles Johns on the scorecards, showcasing a superior mixed martial arts game, from a stinging jab to slick striking to even very good takedown entries and control. Lima showcased that at 27 years old, this kid has a very, very bright future. And again, credit to Talbott for taking on this type of challenge and not trying to just get a layup to try to get back in the win column. And unfortunately for him, I think he's going to end up going on a 2-fight losing streak, as I think Lima is just a superior fighter overall. Talbott may have a smidgen of an advantage in the striking realm, but I think it's nothing that Lima won't be able to overcome. Look for Lima to be competitive with Talbott in the striking until he sets up well-timed takedowns to get this fight to the ground, where I think he has good enough control and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to keep Talbott in bad positions. I don't know if that will lead to a submission victory for Lima, but I think he can put together a good enough body of work to easily grind this fight out and win it on the scorecards. And I think that's why we saw this line go from, I think it opened around minus 125 for Lima, all the way skyrocketing up to minus 200 now. I think for good reason as well. So I'm going to go Lima and Lima by decision. All right, next up, in the lightweight division, we have Beneil Dariush coming in at plus 125, going up against Renato Moicano, who comes in at minus 145. Now, starting off on the Dariush side of things, he was looking to bounce back from a 2-fight losing streak, which is very unfortunate, right? That was a fight, or at least the first of those 2 losses. He had an 8-fight winning streak going into that matchup against Charles Oliveira, a matchup where if he won, he probably would have found himself in a title fight. Unfortunately, after some early success where he was able to get some takedowns and ground and pound, Oliveira was eventually able to catch Dariush and finish him at the ending of the first round. 6 months later, we saw Dariush step foot in the cage against Arman Tsarukyan in a main event matchup at a fight night, I believe that which took place down in Tampa. And Tsarukyan was able to get him out of there in less than a minute and a half, knocking him out and showcasing that Dariush might have some durability issues still. We obviously saw him bite him in the ass earlier in his career, where he lost quickly to Alexander Hernandez, but since then he put together a very solid run that led him to that Charles Oliveira matchup. 36 years old, I think he's still capable of some high-level performances. He just needs to be a little bit smarter with the striking defense, because even though he's performed very well in the striking realm against a lot of guys, you just never know when the chin issues are going to show up and ultimately cause him some issues. We know he's a high-level BJJ black belt. We know he scrambles very well. The fight against Mateusz Gamrot and even Carlos Diego Ferreira is a perfect example of that. This is a guy that just constantly scrambles, doesn't give up bad positions, does a great job in terms of taking the back of his opponents, but in the striking realm often commands a lot of respect from his opponents because of the combinations he throws, the leg kicks, the head kicks. He's still very good all around. It's just whether his durability will show up or not. Now he's going up against Renato Moicano, who they were originally scheduled to fight each other back at the January pay-per-view. I believe that was UFC 311. But after Arman Tsarukyan pulled out of the fight after suffering a back injury on pretty much the day before weigh-ins, Renato Moicano stepped in and ended up challenging Islam Makhachev for the lightweight title. And we know how that went. Makhachev was able to submit and finish Moicano in the first round of that fight. Matchmakers believed Moicano was more deserving than Dariush to step in and take that opportunity because Dariush was on a 2-fight losing streak, whereas Moicano was riding a bit of a winning streak at the time. But Moicano, prior to that, had some solid wins. Finished Jalen Turner after being in some bad positions early on in that matchup. Was able to hurt Benoit Saint Denis early. I think I forgot what it was. I think he exploded his eye, or he caused a very bad cut that ended up stopping that matchup after the second round, after it seemed like Benoit Saint Denis was starting to pick up some steam. And even the Drew Dober fight. That was a fight where, some small mistakes by Dober allowed Moicano to grind that fight out and win it. He's still a very dangerous fighter. We know he has some good Muay Thai. It's really about his jiu-jitsu game, which is where we often see him having some success. He has a very slick submission game. But here against Dariush, I'm kind of surprised that he finds himself as a slight favorite. I get he was on a winning streak, but stylistically speaking, I think this is a very difficult matchup for him. He's going up against a guy, and Dariush, sure, he might be able to clip him, hurt him, and put him away that way. But if he doesn't hurt Dariush, is he really going to be able to lean on his jiu-jitsu? Because we know Dariush is a great scrambler, and it will be very hard for Moicano to establish any type of dominant position to try to have some success there. I don't see him submitting Dariush either. And I think this is a matchup where Dariush will end up using his grappling defensively, countering Moicano, stopping the takedowns, walking him down, landing big shots of his own, and possibly even finding a knockout finish himself. So I really like Dariush in this fight. And again, this all comes down to whether his chin shows up or not. If it doesn't, I'll understand why Moicano is the favorite. But if it does, this is a bad matchup for Moicano. He is not the better striker. He is not the better Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu specialist. It's all coming down to people reading into the winning streak he was on before the Makhachev fight and the fact that Dariush is coming off back-to-back knockout losses. We've seen him bounce back from knockout losses in the past and go on extended winning streaks. Obviously, he's 36 years old now and things might be a little bit shakier, but if he stays conscious, and Moicano's not that crazy of a knockout puncher either, I think this will be a hard night for Moicano, and I'm going to go with Dariush and Dariush inside the distance. All right. Next up, very fun and high-stakes flyweight matchup here between Brandon Royval, who comes in at -105, taking on the short-notice streaking prospect Joshua Van, who comes in at -115. Now, Royval was originally scheduled to go up against Manel Kape in this matchup. Unfortunately, I believe a broken foot or a broken toe of Manel Kape has forced him out of this matchup, and Joshua Van was more than happy to accept it, even though he was coming off of a quick win earlier this month where he finished Bruno Silva in the third round of their matchup. Now, I'll start off on the Royval side of things, who's done very well. He's compiled a 7-3 record since joining the UFC in mid-2020, with 3 of those losses either coming to former champions, Brandon Moreno, or the eventual champion, Alexandre Pantoja, who's beaten him twice. Pantoja submitted him in the first fight, and then in the second fight, he was able to grind out 4 of those 5 rounds and easily muzzle Royval with his takedowns and his control. Since then, Royval has bounced back and tried to evolve his game a little bit more. He went to a split decision against both Brandon Moreno and Tatsuro Taira in 2 completely different fights. In the Moreno fight, I believe that was a short notice fight if I'm not mistaken. Moreno pretty much Royval boxed Moreno, and Moreno used more of a very predictable striking game. I think it was like an overhand left or overhand right that he kept trying to hit Royval with, and then Royval was figuring that out, utilizing his footwork, and then getting on him with the volume and really getting the better of Moreno that night, and then just etched out a split decision. Then he went up against Tatsuro Taira in a main event slot late last year, and we saw Royval, a very competitive fight. Back and forth matchup. It was one where we saw Royval win rounds 1, 3, and 5, and then he ended up getting his back taken and controlled in rounds 2 and 4. But luckily, he stayed away from it in 3 of those rounds, where he was able to showcase being the better striker, stopping the grappling advances of Taira, and even hurting him a few times as well. So it's good to see Royval evolve his game. He used to be a very chaotic fighter, but now trying to lean more into his striking, utilizing his range and his reach and his ability to just put together an unorthodox striking approach, which often causes his opponents some frustration. But he's going up against a superior striker here in Joshua Van, who's been absolutely streaking. I believe he started off his UFC career with a bit of a winning streak, ended up losing to Charles Johnson in a very competitive matchup where he ended up getting finished in the 3rd round of that fight. But that fight was in July. Since then, he's won 4 straight fights. Edgar Chairez in September, Cody Durden, I believe, later on that year, I believe in December, Ray Tsuruya back in March, and then Bruno Silva earlier this month in June, and now he's trying to add the biggest win to his record by taking on Brandon Royval, former title challenger, and if he wins, this could position himself into a title fight, especially when you consider the guy in the co-main event in the next fight, Kai Kara-France, only needed 1 win to earn his shot against Alexandre Pantoja. But getting back to Joshua Van, this is a guy that is a very crisp and clean striker. He manages his distance well. He really reads his opponent in that first round, and then in the second and third rounds really starts to apply the pressure with some good body work, good combinations, good footwork, just walking his opponents down, corralling them up against the cage, and then unloading with some big shots. But it's also been his takedown defense. He's managed to showcase against Cody Durden and Ray Tsuruya, very solid wrestlers, if we're being honest, shut those guys down and beat them to the punch and pretty much sweat them on the scorecards as well. I don't think Royval is going to be looking for takedowns here. I think Royval is going to try to lean into what's been successful for him as of late, and that's been utilizing a ton of footwork, range management, unorthodox strikes from distance, and try to get the numbers up on Joshua Van. But I think after a very competitive first round, we're going to see Van start walking away with this matchup. I think he'll be able to corral Royval into some bad spots, unload with some big shots of his own. I think it hurts Royval a few times. I think Royval's kind of hard to put away. I don't see Van submitting him, but I think he's going to find it difficult to put together enough big shots to get Royval out of there. But I think we'll see Van land the more damaging blows over the course of 15 minutes, mainly those last 10 minutes, and I think he wins this fight on the scorecards. The only thing keeping me from actually wanting to bet this spot, unless Van becomes a plus 130, plus 140 underdog, I'm probably going to stay away from it because, one, the short notice of it, and I have no doubt that Joshua Van is more than up to take in this matchup, but Royval is a very difficult fighter to prepare for, given his unorthodox movement and his striking, and even some of his slick submission game. So that's one thing that kind of just weighs on me here, but also, this is a solid step up from Bruno Silva. This is a guy with an unorthodox style that's going to take some game planning and, figuring out to do for Van to be successful. But I will plant my flag on his side. I think he wins this matchup. I think he outstrikes Royval and wins this fight on the scorecards, but it will be a close fight, just as the odds indicate. All right, moving over to the first of two title fights in the co-main event. We got Alexandre Pantoja coming in at minus 250, looking to defend his flyweight title for the fourth time as he takes on Kai Kara-France, who comes in at plus 210. Now, starting off on the Pantoja side of things, this guy's really had a bit of a roller coaster run to start off his UFC career. He went 6-3 in his first 9 UFC matchups. Even came up short on the Ultimate Fighter, where it was, if you guys remember, it was like that flyweight season where they were putting all the champions from all over the world from regional shows on that show, and the winner would end up to go on to fight Demetrius Johnson. I think it was Tim Elliott that ended up winning that season, but Pantoja ended up coming up short against Hiromisa Yugi Kobo. Probably butchered that name if I'm being honest, but he did come up short against the Japanese fighter. And then Pantoja went 6-3. Through his first 9 UFC fights. Then he put together a 3-fight winning streak that earned him his title shot in mid-2023 against Brandon Moreno. He ended up winning that night by split decision. Very close fight. Could have gone either way. And then he would go on to defend it over the next 3 fights against Brandon Royval, Steve Erceg, and then Kaya Asakura back in December. It's his jiu-jitsu. It's his wrestling, it's his grappling that makes him so difficult to deal with. He has good enough striking early on in fights when he's still fresh, very good leg kicks, some solid power in his hands as well, but it's his ability to mix that grappling behind the striking that has made him so dangerous and so successful at this stage of his career. He's so good at scrambling and so good at in terms of finding himself in a dominant position when the grappling starts to become a thing. And even though his body language looks absolutely horrible after the third round or even second round, anytime a fight gets into the grappling sequences, it looks like he's fresh. He just constantly works, rolls, reverses, whatever it is. He always manages to get the better of his opponents there and then finds places to just breathe and hang out until he can find a position to either get a submission in, maybe get some damage off, but it's all about control and nullifying his opponents on the mat. He's had some close matchups. The Brandon Moreno fight, the Steve Erceg fight. I think the Erceg fight in particular was 2-2 going into that final round, and some bad fight IQ moments from Erceg engaging in the grappling with Pantoja caused Erceg to end up losing that fight. He's going up against Kai Kara-France, who had a 2-fight losing streak prior to his last win over Steve Erceg. It was a knockout loss to Brandon Moreno in a fight which was for the interim flyweight championship. Moreno ended up catching him with a body kick and putting him away. And then a main event against Amir Albazi last year, I believe it was. And that was a close fight. Could have gone either way. The striking stats in that matchup were absolutely crazy. I think he more than doubled him up on strikes there, but still ended up losing crucial moments in some rounds, at least in the eyes of 2 judges that earned that win for Amir Albazi. And upon rewatching it, all the round or most of the rounds outside of round 3 and round 5 were relatively close. So I wouldn't call it a complete robbery, but it was a fight that I think you could firmly state that Kara-France probably deserved the win there. But he's a power puncher at his best. He's a guy, I believe, 3 of his UFC wins have come by knockout, including his last one over Steve Erceg. He was getting kind of stuck at distance with the jab and range of Erceg until Kara-France finally found that moment to crash the pocket and land some big shots of his own. The improvements that we've seen throughout his career has been his takedown defense, mostly in that fight against Askar Askarov, which he was able to keep upright and force Askarov to strike with him where he had an advantage. And, this is a guy that relies on that knockout power or an ability to constantly hurt his opponents to have success. Going into researching this matchup, I really expected to be on the Kara-France side of things. I thought his takedown defense had improved enough that he'll be able to keep Pantoja in the striking realm, and then from there he'll be able to land that big shot to put him away, which is a viable outcome. Taking Kara-France to win by knockout might not be a bad hedge opportunity here, but I think ultimately it's going to be Pantoja that finagles his way into those grappling exchanges, hops on the back of Kara-France, and I think eventually, probably within 3 rounds, we see Pantoja sink in that rear naked choke and force the tap from the New Zealand fighter, or the Maori fighter if we want to say that. But I like Pantoja here. It's tough for me to fully get on board with him at minus 250, knowing some of the cardio issues he's had. And, if Kara-France is able to make it hell for him early, maybe Kara-France reaps the fruits of his labor in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th rounds and maybe finds a knockout then. But I think Pantoja will continuously get to those takedowns, get that top position, get the back of Kara-France, ride these positions out until that submission opportunity presents itself. So I'm going to go Pantoja by submission, and still flyweight champion. All right. That brings us to our highly anticipated lightweight championship headliner here for the vacant title. Remember, Makhachev moving up to welterweight, leaving the title to the winner of this matchup. We got former featherweight champion Ilia Topuria coming in at minus 425, going up against Charles do Bronx Oliveira, who comes in at plus 325. Starting off on the Topuria side of things, this was a guy that I've been big on since, I believe it's been about 7 years now. I originally came across him when he was fighting for Cage Warriors and defeated Brian Bouland for the Cage Warriors title. And then it seemed like he was taking his time in terms of getting his other fights, but he eventually, 2.5 years later, ended up signing with the UFC, had a bit of an abysmal performance against Yusuf Zalal, which he ended up winning regardless. But then since then, he's been nothing short of dominant. He had 6 straight wins that led him to his first title shot down at 145 pounds, and he looked dominant every single time out. Now, the interesting part about that, or his rise to the top in the UFC, was that in his regional stint, he was a guy that would often look to take opponents to the ground and smash them with his jiu-jitsu. He's a high-level BJJ black belt, won his first 7 of his 8 pro wins by submission, but since then, he's only won 1 fight by submission in the UFC. He's looking to knock opponents' heads out. That's all it's come down to. He did it against Alexander Volkanovski after, somewhat of a competitive first 7 to 8 minutes. Topuria eventually wrangled Volkanovski up against the cage and unloaded with the big combination that put him away. And then Max Holloway, he was up, I believe, 2 rounds on 2 judges' scorecards going into that 3rd round. And then he eventually found that big shot to put Holloway away as well. I've kind of harped on him for his boxing approach, but he's so good at it. He's very tight. He's very compact. He moves his feet with him well, which allows him to generate maximum power, which eventually leads to him landing the big shots on his opponent's chin and putting them away. I just love the way he's been able to just put it together and find those moments to unload with his big power shots to put his opponents away. And the fact that he's only 28 years old is even more staggering. Now fighting at lightweight, not having to cut that extra 10 pounds may allow him to generate even more power and become even more dangerous, and he may go down as one of the best lightweights / featherweight fighters of all time if he can keep his undefeated record intact and if he can continue to go out there and finish these fighters right and left the way that he's been doing. But he's going up against a very tough challenge here in Charles do Bronx Oliveira, who will be enjoying a 3-inch height advantage as well as a 5-inch reach advantage. But we know that's not stopped Topuria in the past, as he's still been able to go out there and knock out opponents much taller and longer than him. But talking about Charles Oliveira, who is now 3-2 over his last 5 fights, last time around somehow going 25 minutes against Michael Chandler. Very, very surprised that fight ended up hitting the scorecards, as he had only reached the scorecards 5 times before that in his 44 professional fights. But he ended up utilizing a takedown heavy approach, keeping Michael Chandler on his back, completing 5 completed takedowns, and grinding Chandler out that entire night. I believe he only lost the 5th round in that matchup. Otherwise, swept the first 4 rounds, utilized his Muay Thai approach to set up the takedowns and then control Chandler from there. Normally, Oliveira is very aggressive with getting the finish. This guy often goes out there and either utilizes his aggressive Muay Thai approach to hurt his opponents, to get them to shoot desperation takedowns, where he's been able to wrap up neck after neck and force taps from his opponents. And that's why he holds, I believe, the submission record and I believe the finishing record at lightweight, because of how often he finishes his opponents. But he's 35 years old. He'll be 36 in October. It seems like there has been a certain level of opponent that will be able to stifle him from his aggressive style. We saw the grapple heavy approach from Islam Makhachev. We saw the grapple heavy approach from Arman Tsarukyan. And Topuria may have that ability to stifle Oliveira on the ground. But I think we'll see the Spanish fighter look to walk Oliveira up against the cage, corral him just as he did against Volkanovski and Holloway. And I think his striking defense will be tight enough to eventually wade into that pocket against Oliveira, land a big shot, and put Oliveira away. I would love nothing more than to see Do Bronx be the first person to finish Ilia Topuria and, get that first loss on Topuria's record, just because, Oliveira, big fan favorite, very entertaining, very fun to watch. But I think that this is a horrible stylistic matchup for him. Unless he can keep Topuria at bay, he might have success in the first or second round by utilizing a jab and his speed. But I think it's just a matter of time before Topuria digs to the body, drops those hands of Oliveira, comes into the pocket, lands those big shots to the head, and puts him away that way. I also wouldn't be surprised if Topuria wants to make a statement and try to submit Oliveira. So look for maybe Topuria to look for a club and sub opportunity, but I think it's just a matter of time before he closes that distance, land those big shots, and puts Oliveira away. And new lightweight champion, Ilia Topuria. Now, the last thing I want to say about this matchup, the total is currently set at 1.5, with the under, I believe, being roughly about that plus 110, plus 125 range. If they adjust that total and we can get 2.5 and still get something better than minus 150, minus 200, I may take a shot on that. But, 1.5 makes me cringe a little bit more, as it might take a little bit of time for Topuria to close that distance and get inside the pocket and land with maximum damage. But I expect this fight to not hit the 4th round. I expect this to be done within 2 full rounds, or within, not to start round 3. But I like Topuria by knockout, maybe Topuria by club and sub. But I'm thinking and new Ilia Topuria lightweight champion. All right, there you guys go. I'm very excited for this weekend's UFC pay-per-view card. Going over, nearly an hour breaking down this fight card for you guys. Very, very excited. Cannot wait to see how it goes down. I'll have content all week for you guys as usual. And then obviously dropping breakdowns for Cage Warriors, both their events, as well as PFL. Stay tuned for that throughout the week. Otherwise, I'll see you guys tomorrow for the top 3 Lock of the Night candidates for UFC 317. See you guys then. Peace.